Thank you. I want to say it's very tough to follow Brian Ebel because he's sort of like the Jonas Salk of obesity research. Jonas Salk was an NYU professor as well before he invented the Salk vaccine, and I think Brian's going to do for obesity what Jonas Salk did for polio. So let me just talk to you briefly about New York and why where you go to graduate school makes a difference, but more importantly, how some of the research we do may help clarify some of the choices you make. And I want to say it's great to be in this building because if you were alive 400 years ago, the building wouldn't be here, but one of the greatest brook trout streams would be across the street because that's what New York was famous for. We had very few people, and we had a lot of fish, a lot of animals, a lot of wolves. And you see here, in 400 years, the great secret of New York is that we've basically overcome nature and created a city. And of course, as you may know, in the 21st century, more than half of the population of the world lives in cities. And so wherever you go to graduate school, I just want to say, you know, especially, it's not like undergrad school. You can go to a remote area and smoke pot all day. If you're going to grad school, you're building networks, it's professional opportunities. I want to encourage you to think about cities. And what better place than here? And so you see, the difference in 400 years is the result of government intervention. This is not a work of nature, contrary to most people believe. It's a work of systematic investment by the public and, in many cases, the nonprofit sector. In fact, as I said, not only did we have brook trout, this was the oyster capital of the world. In fact, New York was far better known for its oysters than for any of the financing that you hear about today. Now, let me just point out how we did this. We did this by basically first the civil engineering and planning and building bridges and tunnels that overcame these great water systems which separate New York from the surrounding area because just remember, you may not appreciate, this is an island 14 miles long, 2 miles wide, and you would never imagine that on a given day there are 4 million people on this island. And how does it work? It works because we invest in all the systems to make them flow back and forth and around this, not the island of Manhattan, but also to the rest of the region. And I want to point out especially that long before any other cities in North America, New York invested in mass transit. First, we had horse-drawn carriages, and I want to point out that unlike other cities, ours is 24 hours a day. You know, if you go to Boston, they're closing it now at 12:30. The bars close at 1. You figure that out. And the point that you should know is that not only that, wherever you live, it's distance insensitive. I always find the Washington Metro totally hostile because you pay the further you go. So if the further you go, it's going to cost you more. In New York, wherever you go, the fare is the same. This is totally different than San Francisco with a Clipper card or any of the systems in North America which are really tied to distance. So you should just remember, this is a much more mobile-based environment. And this is one of the great ironies is that New York, we're able to move much faster underground than most cities can move above ground. And I also want to make a key point here. When you go to Wagner, you should be realizing that this is not going to be kind of a slow-paced environment. We looked at the subway ridership. You know, more people ride the subway in New York after 9 o'clock than ride it during the whole day in Chicago. It's just a very different place. And so wherever you're going to be very easily connected to some other part of the city. And I think you should know this is one of the great kind of attributes of being here. You know, they talk about housing being expensive. Yes, housing's expensive, but you don't need a car. And that changes the cost structure of living here dramatically. For those of you who are coming from other countries, I always tell people, you know, New York serves twice as many international destinations as Washington, 4 times as many as Boston. So we are more internationally connected because wherever you want to go around the world, you have more direct flights from New York than any other part of North America. Certainly, LA has more into Asia. Miami is much more into South America, but for the choices of places to go, and that changes the kind of people who come here, it changes the kind of place you can go from here, and I think it's important to recognize it has a huge impact in the day-to-day life of New York, and I'll show you this in a minute. You may worry about this being a crowded city, may be worried about the fact that there's so many high-rise buildings. Well, let me just simply point out that the reason we have high-rise buildings is we make the land work. We put the buildings up in a tall way so you can have more activity in them. And if you didn't have the high rises, you wouldn't be able to have this density of activity. And so high-rise construction in New York is one of the secrets to its productivity. You're able to do more on a given piece of land than you can in almost any other kind of 2- or 3-story building. I remember going to London, and there the buildings used to be very small. They'd never be very tall until the past 10 years. And now they're building skyscrapers. You know, they discovered them in 1995. New York has been having them since really 1905. Remember, the elevator was first invented here in about 1896. Those of you who worry about communications and cities being obsolete, let me point out the ideas generated in New York go around the world. And so this is a map of the fiber optics. And you have to remember almost all the ocean cables to Europe go through New Jersey, which means they go from New York over there. And we have more robust fiber optics on the island of Manhattan, I can point out, than in any other city, and that's because there's so much information flowing here. Remember, those of you not appreciated, MTV was invented here. You get up in the morning and you want to watch TV, and any morning news show is coming from here. At night, the Comedy Central is from here. So whether it's news or nonfiction, it's emerging from New York. LA is still the center for fiction, for Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. It's true, but for anything nonfiction, especially non-Netflix, it's coming from here. Now, what happens about population is very simple. This is a growing urban center. And the reason it's growing is that people want to be here. If you're young and creative and productive and you're in upstate New York, you certainly can't live your life there. Certainly, if you're coming from anywhere in the rest of the world, you see New York as a magnet because it's a place where you can have opportunities. And let me just point out that we've had a great change over 50 years. And those of you who worry about immigration and national policy, immigration is great for cities, and it's especially important to New York because we have about 3.5 million people who are born elsewhere. They don't come here because it's the end of their life. They think it's the start of a new life. But the real change is that we no longer are getting people from Europe, and these charts show you a third are coming from Latin America, 30% from Asia, and of course, we have about 4 or 5% now from Africa. This is a city which replenishes itself. And it replenishes itself because it's quite pro-immigrant, quite pro-anyone with any particular sense of interest and activities, and we're not like much of the other parts of the country. And what I do think is important is that some of the immigrant groups come here because they have social capital. They find other people with the same language, the same interests, the same kind of skills. And so you'll see that for many of the immigrants, we have 20% of all that foreign-born culture coming into New York City as opposed to being dispersed. I want to point out one other thing. This is important. If you look around the country, there's no city which has as many people born elsewhere than New York. And this just shows you this. We have over 3 million. That's really twice as many as Los Angeles. And so other cities are now attracting people, but New York still continues to attract a huge amount of talent and ideas, both at the top end and at the bottom end, because it's a very porous city, meaning easy to enter the economy. This is one of the greatest cities. If you come here, you can get a job without speaking English, without owning a car, without owning a house, just having the willingness to participate. For those of you who want to look at the share of the cities around the country, you know, most cities have a very small share of their metropolitan area. If you go to Seattle, one of my favorite cities, there are 575,000 people, surrounded by 2.5 million people. 20% of the population, the same in Boston. New York, we have 40% of the whole region. We're very fortunate. There's not a first-rate city in Connecticut or the state of New Jersey, so that's naturally why New York has continued to be a magnet. You know, I just wanted to point out how different we are from Mississippi, North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, because about a month ago, the mayor of New York said that transgender individuals have rights to use every public bathroom. This is the opposite of the policy now in 6 different states. And I think if you understand New York, you understand this is a place where diversity isn't just appreciated, it's encouraged, it's welcomed, it's part of the public sector policy. Just the opposite of what you're seeing in so many parts of this country. You know, you may know that if you have time in New York, you may want to see the show Hamilton. But Hamilton came to New York because he was on the island of Nieves, which was a great sugar capital. And sugar was really processed in New York. That's why he came here, because the sugar would be brought here, and we once had the largest sugar refineries in North America, and they're now changing. And I think it's important that the great success of New York is it reinvents itself and repurposes the functions we have on the waterfront and other industrial areas, as you see here in the Williamsburg area, where the Domino Sugar Factory is going to be made into a park and housing and offices. And of course, about 2 miles from there is one of the great recreation centers for ultimate frisbee, McCarran Park. For many years, as the population had declined in Williamsburg, the park was neglected. And now we've reinvested in the parks in New York in a way that we hadn't seen really since the Depression, when the New Deal financed our capital investment. And I hope that if you know anything about New York, you'll realize that almost all of the graduate students at NYU now prefer to live in Brooklyn, where it's really become, you know, the capital of kind of high energy, and I'd say young people living in many different neighborhoods. And one of them, of course, is the reason they have lots of amenities, including this great park, which only opened about 2 years ago. I have to move quickly, and I just want to point out that we're still left with lots of old industrial structures, great challenges in planning and development, including this vast area in Sunset Park, which is now being completely reinvented. There are many people who think, well, how can I be in a city which is so busy? How can I find my life? Well, you know, the Pope came to Washington and Philadelphia, New York. In Philadelphia, they emptied the city for a week. They banned cars, they banned people, they closed it down. In Washington, they did the same thing. They said, don't go to work. In New York, the Pope came. No one knew he was here. We did a study at the Rudin Center, and the same night the Pope was holding Mass in the Garden, R. Kelly was at Barclays Arena. The next night, the Chicago White Sox were playing at Yankee Stadium. this is a city which can absorb all kinds of activities without having the disruption you find other places. And so when you're coming here, it's not as if you're in a big city, you're in a city which is able to accommodate large numbers in different ways, so you don't even feel the kind of press of people. We also looked at the same issue when it comes to protest. Over the past year and a half, the Black Lives Matter protest has gone from one of the most interesting things, from taking buildings to taking highways, bridges, and infrastructure, and nowhere has been this more apparent in both San Francisco and New York. And this is the Brooklyn Bridge. We've mapped it around the country, and you can see Black Lives Matter continues to be important, but one of the great parts is that we've allowed our infrastructure to be used for the protests without basically stopping the city, which occurs in so many other places. Now, I wanted to point out that over the past 15 years, we've had three great shocks. One was a September 11th attack, then was a 2008 financial crisis, and then we had the Sandy in 2012, all of which were different kinds of disasters, nature, terrorism, fiscal. And yet New York is more resilient. It has rebuilt itself, and it continues to do this. And that's because the government is much more active, and the civic and nonprofit sector is a central part of kind of a culture of doing things here, whether it's taking care of kind of rebuilding neighborhoods and houses which basically have been completely destroyed, or whether it's rebuilding what we have at Ground Zero, which has now got much more, I think, public open space than ever had at the beginning. And if you ever have a chance, you should really look at the memorial as well. Now, I couldn't end with pointing out one thing. This is Greenwich Village. And one of the great benefits of Greenwich Village, apart from NYU, is that we're really rich with access. And so within about 2 blocks of here are 17 different train lines, 14 different subway stations. And I just picked a random area uptown where, really, and you wonder there's no arts, there's no culture, there's no great cuisine, because there's no access uptown. And just to prove this, I was trying to look at something more important for you. If you finish your day at NYU, what do? Well, in many places, there's no place to go. Well, that's just the opposite here. This is a small piece of research. 1/3 of all the liquor licenses on the island of Manhattan are within a mile of NYU. And I think this tells you that you're talking about an area that's full of vitality, because we just don't have liquor licenses. We have almost 500,000 public sector workers within about a mile as well of this area. So this has sort of become the center of gravity, I think, for both youth and for energy and ideas. And I think when you look at where you want to study, you want to remember that the environment is as important as the professors, the classes, and all those other things that universities try to tell you about. Thanks so much.